earlier I was joined by the Reverend Tim Costello, CEO of World Vision and a passionate advocate for an increase to Australia's foreign aid commitment. Tim Costello, thanks for joining us.
A pleasure.
Now, yesterday you reportedly described Australia's aid performance as shameful. What aspects did you regard as shameful?
I was talking about where we were. Such a low base, 0.24% of GNI, 24 cents in every $100, which meant we were right at the bottom of the OECD. We're now at 33 cents, and it's bipartisan agreement that we'll get to 0.5, 50 cents. And we need to remember that Britain's already there, and in 2 years we'll be at 0.7, which is also our promise. So at last, instead of being a laggard, we're climbing up to the middle of the pack.
Well, we're climbing up, and in fact that will increase the aid budget dramatically. It'll become the fifth largest spending priority for the federal government, according to some figures, at around $8 billion a year. Is that enough?
Well, it's 0.5, which is terrific, and I think we have to take the public with us, give them confidence that it is being effective, it's having impact, it's saving lives, a confidence I have. But I think we need to remind the public that whilst they're privately generous, World Vision benefits from that, number 1 or 2 in the world in private giving to charities like us. We haven't been generous as a nation. That's why I mentioned that word shameful. It was so low. And even when we think of aid increasing, when we say we've had our floods, it's our turn, it's almost as if we think we're the St Vincent de Paul of the world. We're the most generous. We are the first there. To be reminded that we're 16th out of 23 countries, and a Tory Prime Minister, so this isn't left or right issues, Tory Prime Minister David Cameron slashed and burnt the budget in Britain because of their recession and ring-fenced aid. He said, we will not compromise our promises to the 1.4 billion in absolute poverty. That's the sort of leadership we, when we're in the region where most of the world's poor live, should have in this nation.
Are you worried that the aid budget, foreign aid in Australia, is becoming politicised?
Yes, I am. It goes back to Richard Nixon. There ain't no votes in aid. The charity begins at home and the subtext is, and it ends at home. We'll just look after ourselves. And it's as if we set up a false contest of suffering, that we've got problems, floods, bushfires, so we'll just look after ourselves and forget our moral duties to the 1.4 billion in poverty. Forget that we've made extraordinary progress. 1960, 60,000 kids died each day. We halved that to 30,000 kids dying each day just 2 years ago. It's down now to 22,000 children dying each day. A lot of that's actually due to very simple aid interventions. Rehydration kits for kids with diarrhoea, which is the biggest killer. Mosquito nets, vitamin supplements. We are saving lives, and when Australians hear that, I think they start to gain confidence in what we're doing.
Is there evidence, though, that the bipartisan consensus about foreign aid is breaking down anywhere?
Well, there was a little wobble when there was a discussion over should there be a levy, and the coalition looked at deferring, not breaking the 0.5 promise, deferring it. And I'm very relieved to say that sanity prevailed, and they said, no, we are still committed to 0.5. And I think to put in context, 0.5, 50 cents in every $100. If I say to Australians, let me give you $100 in 50-cent coins. Now, with those 250-cent coins, how many of the coins should we give to the world's absolutely poor? Most will say, oh, 5 or 6 or 7. When I say we don't even give one 50-cent coin, it's only 33 cents, they're shocked. Most Australians think we are much more generous in our aid program than we are. So there's some simple confusion that we have to clear up, and bipartisanship is incredibly important to do it.
Let me ask you about the comments you made at the Forum on Global Aid and Health yesterday, because they were reported as you saying Mr Costello lashed out at the government and the opposition's position on aid to some of its closest neighbours. Are you worried about the way in which our aid is targeted and whether sufficient proportion of it is going to our closest neighbours?
I'm worried that it's not necessarily prioritising essential services. At the moment, Australians would be surprised to know that some 40+% of the aid budget goes to private contractors, to Australian companies. NGOs get only about 6%. About 30% goes to World Bank and multilateral institutions. And what I would really encourage, particularly with our nearest neighbours and Africa for that matter, is spending a higher percentage on health, on clean water, on education, recognising that really simple things. Last year, 900,000 children in Papua New Guinea were immunised. So there's a generation that have a chance of survival. Recognising that it's as little as $2,000 to save a life. One immunisation is very, very cheap, a couple of dollars, but you have to immunise a whole village, and not everyone's susceptible, so it costs about $2,000 overall. Most Australians recognise that that is fundamentally important because it's an investment also in our prosperity. The countries we give aid to, some $300 billion comes back to us in export. Security issues are incredibly important, as we know in this country, and the best way to deal with them is giving an investment to other nations. So it's not just morally right. The sweet spot is it's also in our interest to do it.
Yeah, I think you did describe a health clinic in Papua New Guinea where pregnant women have to bring their own buckets of water when they give birth because of poor sanitation. You cited that as an example of moral neglect, and yet we spend $450 million a year in Papua New Guinea on aid, and that's going to grow, in fact, substantially over the next 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, and this review, the first one in 15 years, which will come out at the end of April, will be handed to the Foreign Minister at the end of April, is very significant in saying let's make sure there's transparency, that there's confidence, that we're focusing on not just poor countries but poor people. Poor countries can get the money and it doesn't actually trickle down to poor people. And with the discussion around Papua New Guinea, I think many Australians will nod their head at that. But the example I cited is because Papua New Guinea, sadly, is one country off track for the Millennium Development Goals, halving the number of hungry, cutting by 2/3 maternal deaths. 1,000 women a day still die in giving birth to children. That's terrible when it's as simple as having traditional birth attendants, having access to the sorts of midwives that we take for granted here. And the moral significance of a short bit of sea between Australia and Papua New Guinea, where we have universal health and very low maternal deaths, thankfully, was really the moral question I was raising about focusing on essential services.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because your criticism is not actually reflected in the World Vision report on essential aid, which came out just a month ago, which actually seems very positive in its assessment of Australia's aid and how it's spent in Papua New Guinea. I mean, basically it's praising the impact that AusAid has had on infant and maternal mortality rates, on immunisation, on AIDS, on TB, on malaria, etc., etc. So I'm wondering, is there a disconnect between your own feelings about what's going on in the report by your organisation?
I think the aid program is incredibly important, but already the review has cut by 1/3 the number of technical, highly paid technical advisors, and many of them were in Papua New Guinea. I think that has been a great announcement by Kevin Rudd. I think the focus on, in our report, on what we have achieved, when you focus on essential services, is not only value for money, but it gives confidence to Australians that we all know there's corruption. We all know that if it just goes government to government, there's huge leakage. Most Australians get that it's like pouring water into a bucket with a hole in it. So there are good ways to do it, and I think this review is almost certainly going to focus exactly on the sorts of things that our report focuses on.
Let's stick with consultants just for a moment. East Timor was complaining to Australia about the amount of aid money to East Timor from Australia, which ends up going to studies and to highly paid consultants, and yet there are people who say that they've been scapegoated, these consultants, and Kevin Rudd has capped the amount of daily salary that each of those consultants can be paid to $600 a day. Some were earning vastly more than that, but the fear now is that you'll get inferior advice.
Yeah, not all consultants and advisors are just greedy or getting it wrong, and you have to be very discriminating. It's certainly the case that in some places consultants have helped with telecommunication systems that's lifted GDP in Vanuatu, for example, by 1%. And when people have income, they know the right thing to do in terms of feeding their kids and giving them proper health care and education. But certainly I think Kevin Rudd was right to say we're going to cap this. The amount of the Australian aid budget going to private companies, most Australians think it goes to charities or it goes directly to people, I think was out of whack, and I think that's why discriminating between that which helps and that which really is a little bit indulgent is a very good call.
So you obviously welcome this review, chaired by Sandy Holway. What do you expect to come from it? What would be the most important thing you'd like to see come from it, for example?
The most important thing is real transparency and accountability. We've actually got something to be proud of. An attack in the Murdoch press that there's terrible fraud in AusAid proved to be completely baseless. Any fraud is bad, but the amount of fraud was 0.2%, far less than Centrelink and money spent here in Australia. So it just fed into that easy, cheap caricature that any money that goes overseas is completely wasted. It doesn't save lives. That just isn't true. And Australians should be proud of the aid program. This review will help them know more about it, feel more committed to the fact that their taxpayer dollars, which really is a levy, what they give to World Vision is their private voluntary giving, that levy, no one likes to be forcibly levied or taxed, is actually saving lives when it's focused, as I said, particularly on essential services. That sort of review, I think, is going to be fantastic.
One final question. The example is given in the piece that just preceded this interview of the national interest test that's put on certain spending. In particular, the Howard government was one example of that during the crisis over asylum seekers, when the Nauru detention centre was actually funded by the aid budget. Was that appropriate, and is that sort of thing still happening?
Well, it's not appropriate. The test needs to be alleviating poverty and focusing on poor people, not just Nauru, because it's solving a political problem for us, so it doesn't pass the test. It means that you can't just spend aid saying it'll all be villages on the Kokoda track, because the national interest in Kokoda means that's where we'll spend it. It's got to have integrity. We've got to live consequentially with our values when we say our aid will impact the poorest and alleviate poverty. That's what Australians expect. National interest is important in saying where is the geographical spread of that aid. It will be in our region, but it shouldn't allow the military in Afghanistan, for example, not to really have to explain how effective their aid was, whether they really consulted with communities, just because we have the military there. So that national test will probably still play a role, but it shouldn't be allowing political decisions that aren't really about poor people.
I've got to ask you a personal question, really. Your brother, as Treasurer, must have been across that decision on using the aid budget to fund the asylum seeker centre in Nauru. Did you have a few words to him about that at the time?
Well, look, I won't go into conversations with Peter, but I will say that Peter was a champion, arguing in Cabinet for the increase in aid. And that increase, which was very low under Howard, started, I think, because of Peter's advocacy. Those concerns also were very legitimately prosecuted by him.
Tim Costello, we'll have to leave you there. We thank you very much for taking the time to come and join us tonight.
That's a pleasure.